I'm here with Lachlan Giles discussing his preparation for ADCC 2019. In the last video, we looked at exactly what Lachy was doing on a daily basis in both the skill development and competition preparation macrocycles. Now we're going to jump right back into the discussion, where we start off by focusing on Lachy's choices around the volume, intensity, and rest periods using his open sparring during the final 8 weeks before ADCC. So I guess what a lot of people will probably find surprising is the fact that you were only doing 3 8-minute rounds during your open sparring. Can you elaborate on why you chose to do that?
I'd usually do about 30 minutes of rolling, and that would be it. But it would be high intensity. You know, it'd be a decent break in between as well. So wanting to feel fresh and roll, and then have a break in between and go again. To be honest, it would differ depending on the day, but and it probably depending who I'm rolling with, but it could be a long rest. It could be like an 8-minute rest, or it could have been a shorter rest. Could have been a 2-3 minute rest as well. Sometimes we would even do no rest, but that's probably looking more at an endurance pace. If I was doing that, if I'm going high intensity, I would need a decent rest, like a good 8-minute rest.
So why is it that you chose 8-minute rounds, and what was your thinking behind the fairly long rest periods?
I still think there's some skill development or error correction that you want to do. So if I was rolling with someone for 5 minutes, sometimes a scenario would come up once, and that scenario I might not come up again in a 5-minute roll. But if I made a mistake once in the first 5 minutes, usually with an 8-minute roll, I get a chance to to correct any errors I've made. So I think you could do 10 minutes, you could do longer. It was interesting, actually. I mean, just comparing this, I know I'm pretty sure at Henzo's, they were doing no breaks at all between their rolls. That was just non-stop rolling for like an hour, I believe, which is, I mean, I suppose like maybe that's like preparing for a 40-minute overtime match for Gordon or something. I'm not sure, but it's less I guess specific to the rule set, isn't it?
So without the wider context, for example, the session goals and how the specific session fitted into the overall plan, it's not really a good idea to try and pass judgment on what you hear other people might have been doing, because often you can get the wrong end of the stick. What I can say, though, is that regardless of the sport, there is a tendency among coaches and athletes to undervalue and sometimes misunderstand the role of rest in training. For example, it's common for coaches to believe that the less rest they prescribe, the better. But when you ask them why, they often don't have a clear answer other than the fact that it makes training harder. But aside from a few applications in relation to psychology, such as building a bond between team members by making them all go through discomfort together, as you often see in the military, the primary goal is not to make a session hard, but to achieve a performance-related outcome, such as improved speed, strength, skill, endurance, or flexibility. A session may be hard as a result, but the discomfort you feel is not the goal of the session, but a byproduct of it. I think most people understand that there's an inverse relationship between intensity and volume. So if you plan to run a marathon, you don't just go and sprint off from the start as fast as you possibly could if you want to achieve the best overall time, or probably even finish. And if you're inserting rest into your workout, you're probably doing so because you want to preserve a certain level of intensity and the benefits that come with that. If there's no rest at all in the session whatsoever, then the maximum pace or the work rate that you can maintain is therefore constrained by the duration of the training session. The longer the training session, the lower the pace that you're going to have to work at if you want to be able to keep going for a significant period of time. In other words, you don't plan your session around how much rest you want the athlete to take. Instead, your minimum rest breaks are determined by the load or the combination of volume intensity that you wish to prescribe. So the thing is that you should start with the load and then decide what the rest needs to be based on what it is you're trying to achieve. Although I think a lot of people in Jiu-Jitsu might be surprised by the relatively low amount of total rolling that you're doing and the quite long rest breaks you were taking between rounds, for me, coming from another sport, actually, it feels relatively familiar. Because what you're describing is common practice across a lot of other sports, especially in the pre-competition mesocycles directly before an athlete competes. So in track and field athletics, we call this kind of workout a specific endurance session. And the definition of specific endurance is a session that is performed at competition level intensity and involves multiple bouts or reps separated by what we call full recovery. Now, full recovery is defined as the rest time that you need in order for you to be able to repeat the bout again at the same level of intensity without also compromising on your technique. So if I give you an example, let's say a 400-meter athlete, that's someone that's running one lap of an athletics track. For them, like a typical specific endurance session might be 2 to 3 reps of 350 meters at race pace with full recovery. Now, the time needed for full recovery depends on a number of different factors, including how hard your muscles need to contract, which energy systems you're tapping into, but it's usually a lot longer than what people might expect. So in the case of this 400-meter runner who's running 350-meter reps, if you're a world-class athlete, maybe you're doing that in 39 seconds. So your total work time will be 39 seconds, the time it takes you to run the 350 meters. But in order for you to recover, to be able to repeat that 350 meters in 39 seconds, you're probably going to need somewhere between 20 minutes and 40 minutes of rest in order to be able to do that. At least if you don't want to significantly have a significant detriment in terms of your technique. Typically, the number of bouts and the rest time taken is determined by both the athlete's ability to maintain competition pace for each bout, but also by the ability to continue to perform with excellent technique, because technique is often a prerequisite for good performance, and it's something you don't want to compromise often, because if you perform with bad technique, you're going to get injured. So in our 400-meter example, even if you were to take, let's say, 2 hours rest between bouts, you probably couldn't do more than, let's say, 4 reps of 350 meters before you would start to run with such bad technique that it would look like you were swimming through treacle. It's just that fatiguing to run 350 meters in 39 seconds. So I think it's important to point out that even though specific endurance sessions are usually performed at the point in the season just before you're going into competition, that doesn't mean that they're the only type of work that's being done during the pre-competition mesocycle, because you can also be doing lots of other types of work. For example, it's common in many sports to also mix in long duration, lower intensity work and shorter duration activity that's maybe done at a higher level of intensity than what you might experience in competition. And the reason for this is because you want to keep the athlete tuned in both on an endurance side and maybe a speed power side. It's just that the large majority of the training will be specific endurance because, as you pointed out, by its very nature, it's specific to what you're going to be doing next, which is competing for real. The thing that I find interesting in jiu-jitsu is the fact that most people don't take really any rest. And what I found interesting about what you're doing is the fact you were taking rest, because that would be more conducive to what I would see in other sports, where when there's a high skill component and it's a high intensity, you definitely generally would need the rest between rounds in order to do that. And if you look at that, you're only doing, let's say, 3 8-minute rounds, but you're doing high quality focus rounds with what you want to work on, which is a different thing to, let's say, the skill development phase, where you're probably taking much less rest, maybe no rest, and you're doing more volume of training because the intensity wasn't as high. And so for me, that was something that straight away I thought was very interesting. And how did that make you feel when you went to taking more rest between rounds? Like, how do you think that affected your game?
Yeah, I think if you're feeling good, like you can do the moves you want to do well, which is, I think it makes a difference for how you roll. Actually, I'm just interested in, because I think you could make a counter argument for jiu-jitsu in that, I guess I feel like this is just from my experience, but I used to get, there's a point in time I did, maybe like, it's probably been like 12, 13 years ago, but before tournaments, I would do all this cardio work and like try to build up my fitness. And I found I would gas out in a very short amount of time. And that was I really felt that was because I was pushing my body beyond its capabilities. Like, I was pushing hard, like I wanted to win and I wasn't pacing myself correctly. And I almost think maybe by doing, I'm just trying to think of like the mindset, but maybe for the long, like, no rest rounds, maybe it's like, would there be an argument that building efficiency, like you're actually you kind of trying to train yourself to work like to be effective at a pace that is sustainable? And is that, because I think, it is a big problem. Like a lot of people burn themselves out, and by the end of the match, they can, barely move, which you almost kind of want that to, like, as long as your performance can be up, you should actually probably be exhausted at the end of the match, or it probably means you weren't trying hard enough. But I guess like is trying to train your efficiency a valid thing for something like jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I certainly think like when you talk about endurance, right? Endurance has many components, of which ability to like use oxygen, for example, is one. The ability to use lactate is another one. So you've heard of like high intensity intermittent training or lactic training. You've heard of aerobic training. These things are important, right? But the other part that's important is the efficiency of your movement. So, you know, when someone comes to jiu-jitsu for the first time, they gas out within like 3 or 4 minutes because they're using all their energy all the time. Whereas when you're training, you're only using your strength when you need to use it at the exact points. And let's say you were talking about Henzo's, and Gordon Ryan in a lot of his instructionals, he talks about the fact that he's trying to slow the other person down as well. So he's trying to be efficient whenever he's training. And it's one of the key concepts that we talked about in the first series, which was, you know, you don't want to get tired because you want to be efficient. And let's say running. Well, there's a factor in running called running economy, which is basically how stiff you are when you hit the floor. And if you're a nice stiff spring, you don't use much energy, you're not using much muscular energy. And the top runners, they use very little energy with each step that they take, right? And they develop this over time. So the top runners, they're both aerobically fit, lactically fit, and from a movement pattern perspective, they're extremely efficient. So efficiency has to be a super important factor. And it's probably in jiu-jitsu, it's more of a factor than anything else. The top guys, if you roll with me, you don't get tired at all because you're extremely efficient, even though I'm a lot bigger than you. And maybe I could be fitter than you, but still you're not getting as tired because you're doing everything the most effective you can. I think that is a huge factor. And I think it's probably more of a factor when you see people getting tired, especially the less skilled people against someone good. They're getting tired not because the other person's fitter than them, but because the other person's efficiency is so much higher. And you see that with wrestlers and other people. They know when to lean on you. They know when to use their body weight. Whereas if I go and do wrestling, I just get knackered within 3 minutes because I'm using all my body weight against you and all my strength, whereas you're just leaning on me, controlling me through that phase. So I think efficiency is a key factor, and it's something you definitely want to work on. Having said that, I think something you said before was very important, which is that if you're training and you're not able to do the move that you want to do because you're too tired, is that an effective way to train? Because then you develop the habit of not doing it. And I see myself doing that all the time. Maybe I could do a takedown, but because I'm so tired, I can stand up, let's say from sit-up guard and do a takedown, take them down with a single leg or something like that. I don't do that because I'm too tired. So I won't go for that move. Whereas if I practiced, if I was fresh, I might go for that move, and then that would become a habit that I do. And in my gym, there's one guy that's just amazing at this stuff. And I'm always like, why don't I do that? Why don't I stand up and just do a single leg, take the guy down? It's an obvious thing to do. Because I'm tired, often is the answer.
How does that training plan compare to other sports, Tom?
So even without doing a deep analysis, I think your program has a lot of similarities to successful programs in other sports, but also clearly has some differences as well. And so my question becomes, are these differences important because of the unique nature of jiu-jitsu, or are they important because they address factors that are specific to your individual circumstances? When I'm analyzing a training program, I start off by always looking at the big picture and trying to establish what the goals are and if they make sense in terms of what it takes to win, and also in terms of the gap that the athlete is trying to close between what it takes to win and where they are now. So as we discussed at length, I think it's pretty obvious that you have some very clear goals and that those goals match what makes sense in terms of what it takes to win at ADCC. So the question then becomes, are you actually addressing these goals in your session design? And that's why it's important to start with the big picture and then zoom in and actually look at what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. Because a lot of people are going to say that they're working on something, but then you look at what they're actually doing in their training, it doesn't exist. Or it's present at such a low level that it won't lead to any significant change in terms of what they're trying to achieve. However, I think it's pretty clear that if you start by looking at your off-camp or skill development macro cycle, that you really are working on these goals. This is shown by the fact that in almost every session is either focused on wrestling or on leg locks. Now, some people could argue that it's almost too focused, but I think that in your situation where you've been training for a long time and you're strong in the fundamentals, this isn't necessarily an issue. As a rule of thumb, all high-performance athletes and teams, they do two things. First of all, they do the fundamentals extremely well. And the second thing they do is they address what we call the marginal gains that separate the very best from the rest of the good. So essentially what they have is what I like to describe as a T-shaped model of expertise, where they have both a broad base, but also are very strong in a specific area. And this idea I originally read about somewhere in the early 2000s in this book, The Art of Innovation by Tom Kelly, who I think was the CEO of IDEO. And, he talks about people needing to have a breadth of knowledge, but also needing to have a depth of knowledge. And a generalist has a broad skill set, and a specialist has one thing they're very good at. But a T-shaped person has both general capacities and also very strong in one specific area. And this is exactly what you're looking for when you're looking for high performers in any field. When I'm analyzing someone's training program, the next thing I like to look at is the flow of the season. And while I'm looking at the flow of the season, I'm asking myself, where has this athlete or team prepared themselves for the demand of either their competition or the next step in the program? So red flags in this instance would include things like going into competition without having spent enough time undertaking specific endurance or conditioning training, and also without practicing under competition environment. And the fact that you were doing ADCC rounds twice a week during your ADCC camp stroke competition preparation max cycle, and you also had those 5 rounds at the Kinetic show, I think it shows that you were certainly prepared for your competition. And the thing that I especially liked was the fact that when you did those rounds, you also had the environment there. So you had people cheering, you had points being scored, you had coaching, etc. So for me, that makes sense because you're trying to, as best you can, replicate what you're going to go into competition. In some sports, you might do this through friendly matches or for low-key matches before the season begins. But I certainly think in your instance, with the fact that you're coming from Australia, etc., that was a very good solution to that specific problem. You know, the other thing that I'm noticing that I think is good is the fact that you're doing 8-minute rounds in your sparring. And I think like 8 minutes is close to the 10-minute standard 10-minute rounds in ADCC. And the fact that you're doing 3 times 8 minutes, 3 of those rounds consecutively with a short 8-minute rest, it also tells me that probably you're ready to also experience the full 50 minutes if you were to go to overtime. And the reason I say that is because although 8 minutes rest sounds like quite a long time, I'd imagine it probably isn't quite full recovery, because I don't imagine that by the time you come to the 3rd round, you'll be producing the same level of intensity that you could achieve in the 1st round. Of course, we can measure this. We can find out if 8 minutes really is full recovery or not by looking at the number of actions you're performing over consecutive sparring sessions as you go through those rounds. But I guess it's probably not quite enough for full recovery. But what it will do is it means that within each of those training sessions, you're going to be experiencing a level of fatigue that's very close to what you're going to have to deal with in the ADCC competition. And therefore, I'm sure that over all of those sparring sessions, and you're doing basically 4 of them a week for 8 weeks across that ADCC competition preparation macro cycle, you will be ready for the demands of ADCC in terms of the physical demands. So I can see that you've prepared there as well. Having done those things, I then look at the structure of the loading employed in each macro cycle. And I try and study also the makeup of the sessions in terms of what's happening on a microcycle level. So the first thing I tend to look at here is how many different programs are being rotated, because the more programs that are rotated, the longer it will take traditionally for someone to reach peak form. And the second thing I'm looking at is, are they repeating the training program enough times in order to get the training adaptation that they're looking for? So I'll give you a really simple example. Let's say someone says they want to train muscle hypertrophy or increase the size of their muscle mass. And research shows us that generally it takes at least 3 training sessions per week for 4 weeks. In other words, 12 sessions in 4 weeks before the muscle even begins to start growing. This is around about the time frame we're talking about. So if someone told me they were planning to increase muscle hypertrophy and I wasn't seeing at least 12 sessions in 4 weeks and hopefully more like up to 24 sessions, then I know that they probably wouldn't be able to achieve their goal. So I'm looking at how many times they're repeating that program within the macro cycle. I'm also looking at the density, in other words, the time between different sessions, and trying to work out if that is appropriate to stimulate the adaptation and or learning that is required. So for an example, endurance sports in general need slightly higher density of training because the intensity tends to be a bit lower, whereas power speed sports need like a lower density of training because they need more recovery between each of their sessions in terms of the high intensity sessions because of the micro trauma that's created by the high intensity of the training. And then the final thing I'm looking at is, as a whole, is the athlete's mind and body able to recover enough throughout that training block in order for them not to get injured? Now, this is impacted by a lot of things, including recovery habits, sleep, nutrition, hydration, and other stresses you're seeing in other areas. And this is kind of quite specific. So in your case, I know that you're actually going to be coaching your training sessions throughout that time. So if I'm seeing that you're training 4 times a day and coaching on top of that, I know that extra coaching, although it doesn't seem like much, that will be an additional stress that you have to deal with. And so for yourself, as someone that's teaching in sessions, I'll expect you to do a lower amount of actual total overall training because you've got to also deal with the fact you've got the stress of dealing with running an academy as well. So that would be like another red flag I would look out for. So if we go down and actually look at what was happening in your skill development macro cycle, you're rotating 2 programs, the wrestling focused program and the jiu-jitsu or leg lock focused part of that. And then in the competition preparation macro cycle, you're also rotating 2 programs. It might not be completely clear there's 2 at the moment, but I would classify them as 2 programs. The first one is the jiu-jitsu focus or the integration sessions, where you're integrating all the elements together, doing your pro jiu-jitsu sessions. And then the second is that ADCC competition rules practice, which is that final round at the end of your session. Because of course, like, I know you're doing it one after the other, but what you could very much easily do is you could do the morning training, then you could take a rest, and in the evening you could do the ADCC round, or you could do more of the ADCC rounds. And that's why I'm calling it a 2-program structure. And if we look at how many times you're undertaking those factors, you're doing the wrestling in the skill development section, you're doing the wrestling focus sessions 32 times within that macro cycle, and the jiu-jitsu sessions 16 times within that macro cycle. And then if we look at the competition preparation, the ADCC camp macro cycle, there the jiu-jitsu focus pro sessions, you're doing 32 of them, and the ADCC competition rule practice, you're doing 16 of them. So we can look at those numbers. And the reason I like to look at those numbers is because I know from my experience in general, at least looking from stuff in track and field and a few other sports, it takes most people somewhere between 16 to 32 sessions to reach peak form, typically for a standard regular individual who's not a fast responder or a slow responder. So those numbers of sessions, they make sense and they fit within the frame that I was looking for. If you were doing a lot less, for example, maybe you were only doing let's say 4 or 5 ADCC competition rules practices, then that would be a red flag for me. I'd be like, okay, I think that needs to probably be increased. But the fact that those numbers make sense, it is a good thing from my side. I'm also looking at the density of the training. So your skill development macro cycle, in there, the intensity is slightly lower. You're saying you're not going as hard in sparring, you're not doing all this stuff. So therefore the density, in other words, the number of training sessions you're doing before a rest, or the amount of rest versus the amount of training you'll do, can be higher. And there you can see you're basically doing 6 days on and 1 day off, which makes sense because the intensity is slightly lower. And then when you move to the ADCC camp, those 8 weeks before ADCC, you now see that the density decreases, right? So now you're doing 4 to 5 training sessions a week and having 2 to 3 days off. And I think that makes sense given the fact that your intensity has risen because you're doing all those ADCC rounds, you're sparring harder, etc. And for me, that's a logical thing that you're doing. Now, the next thing I'm looking at is the loading structure. And when I look at the loading structure, I'm trying to decide if that is appropriate to the nature and demands of the sport. So in general, there are 2 types of loading structures that you can use when you're developing your program. There's what's called a variable loading structure. This is very common in physiological sports. It's also common in sports where they're rotating a large number of training programs. And this is where the load, which is a combination of volume intensity, changes either from day to day throughout the microcycle or across the macrocycle or mesocycle. So maybe go easy, hard, medium, etc. That's variable loading. The other general form of loading you can use is what's called constant loading. And constant loading is more common in something like high skilled sports, and also sports where the competitive exercise, and we'll talk about what competitive exercise means a little bit later on, can be performed in every session. So you have variable loading and you have constant loading. And when I'm looking at your training program, you are using what I call constant loading because there's very little variation in the load. In other words, there's very little variation in the volume and intensity across a macrocycle or a mesocycle. So in other words, you're generally sticking with the 3 times 8 minutes rounds throughout the whole of that ADCC competition preparation macrocycle. You're not starting with 3 times 8 minute rounds, then you're going to 10, then you're going down to 2. You're not changing them around a lot. You're sticking very much with the same number of rounds, and everything is very similar across the macrocycle. Now, I think this makes sense in jiu-jitsu because in general, it's not really that much of a load-bearing sport. If you're doing something that involves a lot of running or is a team sport, then that is generally is high weight loading, high weight bearing sport. And as a result, you're going to experience a lot of micro trauma, which means that people that tend to do that kind of training, they tend to need to have a bigger variation in their load. So when they're doing a session that involves lots of running, the next day they need to do something that's maybe a little bit more unloaded in order to allow the structures of the body to recover. But given the nature of jiu-jitsu and the fact a lot of it's unloaded, I think it makes sense to use that constant loading. Now, in my opinion, where you can use constant loading, I think it makes sense. And the reason I think it makes sense is because basically by keeping the loading similar, you're cutting out something that fluctuates throughout your training. And therefore it makes it easier for you to analyze peak form and analyze the impact of changing the different types of other different types of factors in your program and what impact that has on the overall training program. So as I said, in general, if I'm doing constant loading, for me, that's actually a very beneficial thing because it allows me to work out how to peak for competition a little bit easier. It's maybe a discussion goes beyond what we're talking about today, but that's the basic idea. Now, having done all that and looked for any red flags, I then go down even further and I start to look at the type of exercises used in the session. And I do this by categorizing them using something called the exercise classification hierarchy. Now, the exercise classification hierarchy was originally created by a guy called Anatoly Bondarchuk. He was the head coach for the USSR in track and field. And in track and field, there's actually 24 different events. So he needed a way in which he could compare the training and the structure of the training between the 24 different events. For me, it's a great idea because it allows you to create a common language which then you can use across different events in the same sport and also across different sports. So I can take a structure from something like fencing, for example, and I can try and decide, would that work in another sport, let's say soccer? And you can compare and contrast the structures without having to go into the detail of what is actually happening. So the way the exercise classification hierarchy is created is that you essentially have this pyramid. At the very top of the pyramid is the event you're training for. And then as you move down the pyramid, you classify exercises into 4 groups. You've got a competitive exercise, you've got what we call specific development exercises, then specific preparation exercises, and then at the bottom, general preparation exercises. And we shorten these names to CE, SDE, SPE, and GPE. And the basic concept is the higher up the hierarchy they are, the more specific and the more the exercise will transfer to the actual given event. So at the very top, you've got the very technically based exercises, and towards the bottom, you've got the more generic and physically based exercises. So let's have a quick look at how this exercise classification hierarchy would work for no-gi ADCC rules competition. So you have your spectrum of exercises starting from very generic or general on the left-hand side through to specific on the right-hand side. And there we have our 4 classifications. On the far right, we have our competitive exercise, then we have our specific development exercises, then our specific preparation exercises, and our general preparation exercises. And when we look at the nature of these classifications, what we see is the ones on the far right, the first 2 on the far right, they replicate the sport's movement, which means they look like the sport itself. So when you see someone doing these exercises, you know that they're a jiu-jitsu practitioner. Whereas the other 2 classification exercises, the ones that have preparation in their title, they don't replicate the sport's movement. So if you saw someone doing those exercises, you wouldn't necessarily know what sport they were involved in. So that's in terms of sports skill. Now, if we look at it from conditioning perspective, what we see now is that the first 3 classifications, your competitive exercise, your specific development exercises, and your specific preparation exercises, these act like the competitive event itself. In other words, they stimulate the same systems that you're going to use in competition. So when you're doing these activities, you are preparing yourself from a conditioning perspective for what you need to do in competition. Whereas your general preparation exercises on the far left, they aren't specific to what you're doing in competition. And therefore, undertaking them, while it will have some benefits, won't necessarily transfer to competition in the way that specific preparation, specific development, and competitive exercises will do. In jiu-jitsu terms, your competitive exercises, they're your no-gi, open sparring, and specific sparring. They're the closest thing you're going to get to doing actual competition. They look like the event, and they train the same physiological systems. Moving down to the specific development exercises, these are exercises that are where the competitive exercise is broken down into specific parts, and those parts are then trained or overloaded. So a good example of this would be doing drills for jiu-jitsu technique. You're taking something that you would do in live sparring, you're breaking it down into its component parts, and you're practicing those over and over again. In this bracket, you can also put the things that make up jiu-jitsu. So for example, you could train wrestling, you could train judo, you could also train gi jiu-jitsu, because here you've taken the key core elements of jiu-jitsu and you've broken it down, and now you're overloading it in a specific fashion. And the final type of exercise that forms this category is something called specific strength training. Now, specific strength training, a good example here is like what you see in the picture, is where you take a component, you overload it. So for example, you could be practicing your shot in wrestling. You could have someone holding like an elasticated cord behind you, and therefore you're going to be overloading that wrestling shot. So that's a good example of of the specific strength exercises. In jiu-jitsu, they're not as common as they are in some sports, but in some sports, specific strength exercises are very, very, very important and are very common. So for example, if you look at throwing events, in throwing events, there's a huge number of specific strength exercises they undertake. And these exercises are very important for driving sports form and improving the performance of the athlete. Then if we move on and look at specific preparation exercises, this is basically your classic strength and conditioning. It's your strength training. It's your alactic, lactic, and aerobic conditioning, or your cardio. These are the things that fall into this category. And then your general preparation activities. These are things that are generic to making you good as an athlete. So they are general strength, for example, push-ups, burpees, things like flexibility, and also things like yoga. The key thing to remember about general preparation activities is that they are important because they develop you as an athlete on your own. And they're pretty much what every single athlete will probably need to do at some point, regardless of sport, throughout their career. So once we know what the different exercises are and how they break down into the 4 classifications for each sport, what I then do is I look for red flags in terms of the types of work that are being done relative to the goals of each macro cycle. So for example, in the macro cycle that comes immediately before competition, in other words, the competition preparation macro cycle, in general, for almost any program, regardless of sport, what I'm looking for is that competitive exercises are in that program. Now, there are a few examples of some sports where you wouldn't do the competitive exercise because, for example, it's just too dangerous or it's too hard on the body. But in general, you definitely want to see a high proportion of your training being competitive exercise right before you go into competition. Similarly, if someone has something like a general preparation macro cycle, during the general preparation macro cycle, you want to see stuff towards the left-hand side of that continuum. So you're looking for GP and SP activities to be in that general preparation macro cycle, because the whole idea of a general preparation macro cycle is to develop your body, and that's what exercises on the far left do. Similarly, if you had a specific preparation macro cycle, I would expect to see SDE and competitive exercises in that macro cycle. And if I'm not seeing that, then it probably means that the person is not going to achieve the goals that they're looking to achieve. So once I know how to classify exercises for a given sport, I then go back and I look at someone's daily training program and I try and break it up into those 4 classifications. And then I look at how the exercises in each of the classifications compares from one macro cycle to the next. So if we look at your AFCAMP skill development macro cycle, we can see there's lots of SDE in that because you've got lots of wrestling training in there. And that's a very good thing because what you're doing is you're overloading your wrestling by training not only wrestling individually, but also you're training with athletes that are better at wrestling than you are, that are probably better than jiu-jitsu practitioners in terms of their wrestling prowess. So you're overloading that. And in the long term, when you transfer that through and you make adjustments to deal with the rules of jiu-jitsu, that should have a good transfer into how you're going to do in competition. If we compare that macro cycle, for example, with your ADCC camp, your competition preparation macro cycle, now we can see the pattern has shifted, and clearly you have far more competitive exercises and competitions during your ADCC camp. And I'm classifying competitions as your ADCC rounds and also as the kinetic competition rounds that you did as well. So comparing those side by side, you can see that there's a big difference between your off-camp skill development and your ADCC preparation, competition preparation macro cycle. And given what we talked about in terms of your goals, I think this makes obvious sense why this is the case. However, when I look at your training program in general, the one thing that's very noticeable is the fact that you have no SPE in either macro cycle. So nowhere throughout your entire training program do you have any SPE. Now, what this means to me is it means that your program is generally focused on the development of specific skills. And therefore, you're relying on a strategy that uses training to develop specific skills to also develop your physical capacities that you will need for competition.
Yeah.
And this is quite a different strategy than the other strategy that is used in a lot of sports, where you unbundle the conditioning and separate it out from the skill training. And therefore, that's where you see your classic strength and conditioning. So in many sports, you'll see your classic strength and conditioning, and then you'll see your skill component. Sometimes they can be completely separate, as in the case, let's say, for table tennis, for example. And sometimes you combine them together. For example, in team sports, you'll see people often doing their strength and conditioning. And then, of course, they're going to get some level of conditioning through practicing the game, for example, as well. Now, as I know from other sports, this has both strengths and limitations. And the question becomes, is this a good strategy for use in jiu-jitsu? And is this a good strategy in terms of your specific, unique requirements in terms of you as an athlete? So hopefully you can see the beauty of the exercise classification hierarchy is it allows you to analyze a training program by removing the sports detail and allowing you just to focus on the underlying structure. So just by looking at how much training you're doing across the 4 different classifications, you can get a really good sense of what the program is, what the strategy is that the person's using, but also the fundamental assumptions that they're making about their sport and about how they're going to develop and what's important in it. So to quickly recap how I analyze a program overall, I start off by looking to see if the program has clear goals and if the goals of each macro cycle make sense, given that macro cycle's proximity to competition. I then go and I look at the individual daily training and make sure that the goals of that macro cycle are reflected in that daily sessions. I also look at the number of programs being rotated. In your case, you're rotating 2 programs. And I think this is sensible given the fact that you have 16 to 32 sessions. And this is typically the kind of range in which most people reach a peak form. So I know that from the number of programs you're rotating, this kind of makes sense given the timeframes you're talking about. I also look at the loading structure. I see if that's appropriate to the sport. As we talked about, you're using a constant loading structure, which I think makes sense for a sport like Jiu-Jitsu because of the fact that both it's not a weight-bearing sport, so you don't need to really fluctuate volume intensity a lot. And also because I think it makes sense in terms of allowing you to more easily track peak form, which is already pretty damn difficult in Jiu-Jitsu. And then I look at the distribution of training methods between the macro cycles in terms of the exercise classification hierarchy, and I look to see if this is logical and makes sense. So for example, there I'm looking to see if there's SDE during skill development macro cycle, for example. And if when you go into the competition preparation macro cycle, is there enough competitive rounds? And are we doing enough CE style training, in other words, open sparring training? So having performed that analysis, I guess the key questions that would probably pop into my head initially would be, are the 32 sessions of open sparring that you're doing during the competition preparation macro cycle the right number in terms of preparing for ADCC? And are the 16 to 21 competitive rounds you're taking, including the ones from Kinetic, enough in order to get ready for the competition intensity and the rules of ADCC? Or could you use fewer, or do you need more? I mean, they would be the key things that I'd be exploring to start with. And then the other question, of course, is, does it make sense, given the unique nature of Jiu-Jitsu and your individual circumstances, not to include SPE in your training program? Or would a strategy that somewhat unbundles strength conditioning, allows you to work on it more, be something that would bring you a benefit? And of course, what we have now is we have an example of something that you've done, something that's been successful at. So we know this program works. It's not about making massive changes to it. What it is, though, is about then experimenting to find the optimal solution for yourself. Mm-hmm. And so the way that we do that is that essentially we'd come up with a couple of different alternatives. We'd find some competitions that you're going to go and practice these alternatives at. And we go through the cycles again, trying out some of the different ways in which we could arrange that training program. We'd hopefully plot your sports form, plot how you're feeling and what you think the benefits are of the different ways in which we could organize the structure. And we try that out on 3 or 4 occasions until we start to come to a conclusion about, okay, what you're doing now is the optimal way of doing it, or these are the few different ways in which we could tweak the training program in order to improve it. So I'm gonna have to ask the question now, why no strength and conditioning in your program? What's the reason for this?
It's obviously, I see that it can be important, and probably more so for something like wrestling than jiu-jitsu, where I think strength and power probably plays a bigger role. But usually, or just about every match I've lost, when I've analyzed it, there's a technical error that I've made. You know, if you look at the match of Lepre or Gordon, you know, there was a thing that I could point out that if I had have done this, that exact sequence wouldn't have. Doesn't mean I would have won the match, but that exact sequence that we saw wouldn't have happened. So I just feel I get better bang for my buck working on improving my skills than my strength and conditioning. And I really do feel like it's, for me anyway, at least, yeah. In fact, I do feel that it's one or the other in terms of time to training. You know, like if I do a strength training session, that means I'm not going to do maybe a jiu-jitsu session that day or whatever. So it is I have to substitute it. It's not just adding. I can't just add strength and conditioning. I can for stretching. I think I can add stretching, and that's why I'm doing stretching, because I can add stretching with very little have any impact on my ability to perform the other sessions. You could make a great argument for doing strength training. Like there's plenty of people who have done well with that, but then there's plenty of high level jiu-jitsu people who don't as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's good. And I think I asked you that like specifically to be, provocative, to ask you why, because I actually think that in jiu-jitsu, there's a good reason why you wouldn't do strength training. That actually we'll probably get into this now, right? So if you look at the exercise classification hierarchy, as what I talked about before, is that the things towards the right-hand side, in this case, the C and the SD, they train the same systems that you're using when you're competing, right? So you're going to get stronger doing jiu-jitsu, right? There's lots of people that come into jiu-jitsu as the only thing, and they lose weight, they get stronger, whatever else. So the things towards the left, SDE and the SPE specifically, they use the same systems that you use in your competitive exercise. What does this mean, right? This means that those things are going to compete for your recovery ability. So if they're not important in your sport and you're doing them, then you're taking away from your recovery ability you need for your competitive exercise, which we know transfers to performance. And so for me, it makes sense in jiu-jitsu that if you're going to get as strong as you need to get by doing jiu-jitsu, you might not necessarily need to do your strength and conditioning. The other thing is that when you do anything that's related to strength and conditioning, it generally tends to be high load and it tends to be relatively high intensity. And you're doing a movement pattern that's repetitive, which is the other thing. So there's quite a lot of people that probably get injured doing strength and conditioning. And actually you can see this in the UFC statistics, doing strength and conditioning, because they're doing a movement pattern that's repetitive. Like let's say cardio, let's say running. If you're going to do just purely running, then you're going to get all the injuries associated with doing running as well. So there is quite a good argument for not actually doing this. Or if you're going to do it, to spread it out across your training program and try and do it in lots of different parts for something like jiu-jitsu. And so I think there's a good reason why you wouldn't do that. And what you've basically done is you've said, I'm going to take this thing out that I don't think that's important so I can focus on my CE. And from my perspective, that makes sense. The only question that I would say is that if I was sitting with you as a performance director, I would say, okay, that makes sense. Let's quantify how important these strength qualities are to you if we could do them in a short period of time and if there was a way of implementing your training program. And let's do a cycle where we implement it, see if it makes a difference. And if we think it does, continue or refine it. And if we don't, let's go back to what you were doing before. That would be kind of the suggestion that I would come up with from as a performance director, someone that was making suggestions into a program, because that I was trying to see how we could impact your performance overall. So I think, as you said, you're working on SDE. You're putting a lot of effort on your SDE, on your wrestling or whatever else. That has a strength component that is transferring directly to your sport, whereas your strength training, it doesn't have that technical component. So you are developing your strength more, but you're already covering a lot of it by doing wrestling, a lot of it by doing jiu-jitsu. So that trade-off you talked about, for me, it makes sense. And as we talked about, as we can talk about, there's lots of guys in jiu-jitsu who've been very successful. I believe Marcelo Garcia never did any strength training, really, at least in most of his competitive days. And everyone that I know that have rolled with him, they said, wow, that guy's legs are just incredible. He can just lift you up with his legs and, butterfly sweep you whenever he wants to. And he got that from just doing jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, there seems to be quite a few. I mean, there's plenty that are doing strength training as well. So, yeah, I think I don't know. I don't enjoy it as well. That's probably the other reason, but that's a laziness reason. But yeah, I don't know. I really do feel that there's usually a technical answer for everything. So, but I do think actually the more elite you get, the more you get diminishing returns on technical development, and probably therefore like the gains you might get from something like strength training could be greater. But I think I'm set in my way now.
Yeah, it comes down to where you are in your career as well, right? If you were a 22-year-old athlete and you had a long while to go, maybe strength training was something you'd introduce. Whereas if you're towards the end of your career, it might not be something that you want to necessarily bring in, or it might be something you definitely want to bring in. It depends on the individual athlete. And I would say that the other thing is that because jiu-jitsu is a rapidly developing sport, it isn't yet mature. I think the physicality side of things, while it is important, it's probably not as important as the technical side of things. But let's say we go and look at something. So something I was surprised about when I moved to Aspire was we worked with this fencing coach, Massimo. He's coached the last 2 Olympic champions from when they were kids through to like a Olympic gold medal. And he put a massive emphasis on strength and conditioning and for fencing, which is something that I wouldn't have thought of. I'd thought of like jiu-jitsu as being a very technical sport. And actually, interestingly, when you talk to some of these sports that are now starting to evolve a lot, they actually are putting more emphasis on S&C as the gap between the different between their competitors gets closer and closer. So let's say something like table tennis. Again, table tennis, you don't need to be that fit to do it, but yet they do a lot of it because it helps their cognitive development. It helps with the blood flow, which allows them to learn more. And even something like lawn bowls, very interesting in Australia. In Australia, if you look at your lawn bowls team, it's not made up of 50, 60-year-old people. It's made up of young people who all do S&C. And actually, I think there's now a certain age at which they ask you to retire from doing lawn bowls. They can bring young people in because that physical quality, now that sport is evolved, is becoming more and more important. And bowls, like what could be more skill dependent than bowls? There's like no physical things, yet it still helps them. So I think as jiu-jitsu becomes more evolved, as it becomes more established, maybe in no-gi first, because that's the one with maybe less moves, you will start to see physicality become an important factor. And maybe in 10 years' time, if we were sitting down doing this, then we would have to be talking about how we'd work strength training into the equation, which was the whole idea of last time when we talked about what it takes to win. It's not what it takes to win now, it's what it will take you to win when you want to compete, which could be, if it was 2 cycles down the road ADCC, that might be very different to what it takes to win in 2019 or in 2021.
Yeah, we'll see.
Hey, so Lachy, thank you ever so much for for talking to us today, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope people have some some comments that they could thing and actually give to us. And actually, I'll be very interested to do this with some other ADCC competitors and compare and contrast the training between the two different people, because I think yours will be quite different to what other people have done, for example.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting, actually. No, that's great, Tom. Very good. I probably should add on to this. So, I mean, I appreciate that my training has some semblance to what a good program would look like. I do think there's certainly a lot of room to improve as well, and that's what this, I guess, part of this discussion. Hopefully, we take we've been taking away a lot of things that could make it a lot better for the next one, and just taking the things we discussed and making them better, and I think more strictly planned, and working with the athletes from the team to do something very similar to that for themselves. So, and probably for the ADCC trials, which are coming up